So this is actually my 5th time giving this talk, and it's always a joy and a delight to present at the Silicon Valley Code Camp. Hope you guys are having a lot of fun, and you know, on a Saturday afternoon, 3:30 p.m., when it's like 70 degrees and gorgeous outside, all you want to hear is UI design fundamentals. That truly warms my heart. So hats off to you guys. Thank you so much for being here. This is really fabulous. And it's great to see such tremendous response. And I'm hoping I can deliver on the goods. I will start with a bit of an apology, and then maybe some flattery as well. So, and I apologize, I do not have the remote control, so I'm going to have to run back and forth here a little bit. But a little bit of an apology. You know, I'm going to kind of set the bar kind of high here, right? So we got about 60, 70 minutes or so, and it's a little bit unfair that I'm going to blast through the fundamentals of UI design in that amount of time. Usually this takes about 16 weeks of a college semester course, right? All kinds of stuff from mechanics of interface design, including some of the more exploratory kind of ethnographic aspects of creating an interface. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. I will make no guarantees that by 5 p.m. you will suddenly make the most beautiful, most useful UI on the planet. That's not going to happen, I don't think. If you do just prove me wrong, please tweet it out, let me know. But I'm hoping that we will get a baseline. We're going to do a level set and get everyone on board in terms of what it means to create a great user experience and what does it mean to create a really good UI as a part of it. All right. So I just want to kind of level set on that point. And also a little bit of flattery. I mean, I envy you guys, right? I'm assuming most of you here are front-end UI engineers, right? Coders, developers, programmers, right? Do we have any back-end engineers in here? Sysadmins? Oh, wow. Awesome. That's great. And do we have any designers? Just straight up visual designers, graphic designers, all that kind of stuff. Great. Awesome. Those of you who are actually coding the UI, I really envy you because you hold the power in your hands. You are the ones who are constructing the bits, the actual code that will be abstracted and then presented to the user in a way that will enable someone to accomplish their task and hopefully go home a very happy person. As a designer, you know, part of my role, certainly at Citrix as principal designer, is to help facilitate those conversations, to be a thought leader and evangelist, and of course I do some of the pixel pushing myself as well. But those of you who are coding the interface, you have a tremendous burden, responsibility, and awesome power ahead of you. So hats off to you again for wanting to learn more about these fundamentals. So as I said, this is actually my, oh sorry, there's still a little bit more of an intro on that. So one of the things that I've been doing, every time I give this talk, I do give a bit of a caveat that, you know, I'm not going to present some kind of absolute scientific proof, prescription, formula, or recipe for how to create the best, most perfect UI. That's simply an impossibility, and I will go into that further. Every year this comes up as a common refrain or constant criticism, which I fully acknowledge. But this year, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. And I am going to get a little bit more into some do's and some don'ts. I know everyone in the audience, or at least previous times I've given this, a lot of people in the audience are clamoring for that checklist. What is it exactly I need to do, Mr. Gajendar? How many pixels should this icon be? How much? How tall should the text be? And what's the line height? How much white space? All that kind of stuff. Well, you know, I'm not going to get that specific, but I will present some do's and don'ts. But before I get to that, allow me to indulge, if I may. Since this is my 5th time speaking, I think that's a bit of a landmark. A lot's changed. The first time I spoke was 2007. And if you imagine that, wow, 2007, that was a long time ago, right? A lot's evolved since then. That could potentially impact what it means to create a compelling user interface, right? We got smartphones, the rise and fall of Flash, now the rise of CSS, HTML5, widescreen flat displays, and also this is a little bit strange, so apologies for that. Responsiveness, the notion that you can create a design that can actually be coherent across different kind of screen layouts. Now we're dealing with high resolution displays, like the Retina display and so forth, that are beyond 72 ppi. And of course, the advent of social mobile cloud, all that kind of hipster kind of stuff that's really exciting, wonderful, and new. So it kind of raises the question, are these UI fundamentals evolving and changing? Well, not so much, right? But there are certain things that still stay the same despite all these wonderful advances for UI and UX. Right? This was something I encountered just 2 days ago. I was registering for a demo expo, technology conference actually in Santa Clara. If you attended this. And you look at this registration page. I don't know about you, but there's a lot of words. There's a lot of text. And the text tends to be repetitive. It starts off with demo as kind of a logo. Welcome to demo fall registration. Ready to hear to experience the demo. How to successfully register for demo. Okay, I get it, right? I'm on the page to do demo. First point, enter your email address. Well, that should be self-sufficient, or self-explanatory. Number 2, there's some conditional statements I gotta follow, I gotta think about, right? If a registration code is pre-populated, what are you talking about? What? Select your attendee category, what? Hit apply code, then hit, I'm already lost, I'm confused. After I make my way through that kind of jungle of words, then I come to this page. I'm like, oh my God, are you serious? Really? I gotta go through, I don't know, 32 different fields, and wow, I just love how the text is just slammed against those fields. Oh, and the other thing, I'm trying to make sense of this field. If you noticed before, way down here at the bottom, you guys probably can't see it, there's a required field indicator. Way down at the bottom, just in case I miss it, let's just stick it down. But here, let's just put it at the top. Also, if you notice, the last section here is called additional information. That's the subhead. Oh, it's totally cut off here, so you don't see it. It actually, there are required fields for this. So these are actually all required. So if it's required, why is it called additional information? I don't know. But then finally, after I get through that, I got an error. Apparently, my job title is too long. I don't know. Principal designer. I thought 2 words would be okay, but hey. And the field seems like it would support at least 140 characters. And it makes me wonder, wow, is it really 2012? I don't know, sometimes I don't know. Oh, that's kind of a funny way of pointing out, the fact is, despite a lot of these advances in resolution displays, and smartphones, and smart technology, and all this kind of stuff, I saw that Mustang out there that's connected to Windows system or whatever. Despite all of that, the fundamentals don't change. You are creating an interface that's going to communicate, that's going to engage, and enable someone to perform a task. At the end of the day, that's all going to be the same, right? Now, the variants, the nuances will evolve and change, of course, per device, per screen format, and I'll get into more about that soon. But it reminds us, or it should sort of remind us, that, as Paul Rand, I don't know how many of you know Paul Rand, legendary graphic designer, he made this quote saying that, the public is actually quite much more familiar about bad design than good design, right? They're conditioned to prefer bad design because that's what we live with, right? The new stuff that is supposedly much better is somewhat threatening, a little bit, because we don't understand it's new, it's different, right? So when we go around to the world, we look around the web, and we see stuff like this, we think, oh, okay, that's fine. Well, no, it's not fine. It's actually bad. It's inexcusable. And we see this with all kinds of other UIs. There's some favorites that I've always kind of picked out and refer back to. There's tons of buttons and lots of tabs and overly, gratuitously done kind of skeuomorphic kind of interfaces and so forth. My favorite about this example, and those of you who have seen this talk before know that I refer back to this all the time, this has a pro mode. I'm not sure what the pro mode is. If this is, I guess, the non-pro mode. But there's a lot going on here. And truly, I'm making fun of this stuff, and I'm being a little bit, kind of snarky and sarcastic and stuff, but I gotta believe there's some valuable, essential functionality that's trying to be exposed in the interface, right? It's just not coming through clearly. It's not being communicated effectively, right? And it's not just software interfaces. We see this in the world around us. If you get car dashboards, remote controls are always kind of a big fill-in for this kind of stuff. There's buttons all over the place. And I love ticket vending machines. I think this one is from BART or one of the other transit systems here. You've got these kind of compensating gestures of putting labels everywhere, where you're really supposed to stick your bills and coins and all that kind of stuff. Oh, and then, by the way, press here to start. So clearly, 5 years after you started this in 2007 and continuing now, there still needs to be a lot of education. There needs to be a level setting about what it means to create a really good interface. And if you look at those examples that I pointed out, it really comes back to, I think, just a couple of basic things. Right? How do you balance the complexity of the functionality? There's a lot of complex stuff, right? You got to present, you got to push it out there. Some of it's extraneous, so we got to figure out, what do we kind of cut out. But then also craftsmanship. Right? The careful and due diligence of making sure that the elements you're presenting on the screen are properly aligned, right? That they are properly grouped, there's a meaningful relationship, and you're actually guiding and directing the user to accomplishing their task, right? And getting something done. Too often the case is, if you look at any of these interfaces and any others that are problematic, they have too much stuff, right? Too many fonts, too many lines, too many icons, too many buttons, too many tabs. A lack of hierarchy, a lack of emphasis where it needs to be placed, right? To give the user through the interface. The user doesn't use the interface because they want the interface. They're using it to get something done, right? And so it really comes back to this. We'll keep referring back to this complexity and craftsmanship. How do you balance the two, right? To achieve something that's really useful and meaningful. One of the things to really understand before we get into kind of the do's and don'ts of UI fundamentals is recognizing the fact that everything you put on the screen, no matter how small you may think it is, how trivial you think it is a signal to be processed and learned. It is a visual signal, right? If it's text, it's a button, it's an icon, some kind of image, an animation, right? Motion cues, that kind of thing. But it's also a cognitive signal, right? That a user has to interpret and understand to make sense of it and decide, okay, is this guiding me? Is this helping me? Is this hindering me? And so forth. All that stuff happens in an instant, right? And there are various psychological books or psychology books that can explain some of the phenomena of the mind and perception and interpretation and so forth. I'm not going to get into that now. But the point is, everything you put on the screen is a decision point. It's a decision point for you, the developer, and for the designer to work together and make sure that they coincide and make something meaningful for the user who has to figure out, okay, out of all this complexity, what's really most useful for me, right? And how do I get through this? By the way, I'm just going to go ahead and put a quick plug. Right after this talk, I will be giving a talk around partnering with the designer. And what does it mean to actually collaborate with the designer and have those kinds of discussions and those kinds of trade-offs and compromises and so forth. So that's coming up right after this, so maybe I don't want to today. But coming back to this point, everything you put on the screen is a signal. Right? So there's certain do's and don'ts around how do you manipulate, how do you kind of present those signals. But before we get into those kind of what should you do, what should you not do, it's important to understand that, as I was saying earlier, you are the arbiters, the mediators of a conversation, a dialogue between a user and something they're trying to do, some kind of system, right? Whether it's a smartphone or a website or a kiosk or whatever it is. That interface, here represented as an orange line, that's the divider, that's the interface, that is the mediating kind of fulcrum, right? Between the person who's trying to get something done, who's trying to interpret and figure out, is this the right interface for me? Am I doing things correctly? Am I getting feedback to make sure that I am doing it right, I'm not being penalized, right, and I can make corrective actions and so forth. So it's about a conversation. It's a dialogue, right? That's a really critical point. The interface is the mediator of a dialogue. You're talking to people. So what does that mean in terms of what you got to do and what you don't have to do? Well, first, before we get into that, you got to start with your users, with your target audience, right? Now, those of you who are engineers, how many of you talk to your users? Yeah, a few shaky hands here and there, right? Yeah, okay. No, it's good. It's good, right? Any attempt, hey, at least you're making that effort, right? That's great. You got to understand the user's mindset, right? Before you even get down to, okay, where do I put this button? You got to understand what's most useful to this person, right? What does he or she need? What is their background, their level of understanding, their mental model, right? Where are they coming from in terms of their kind of technical know-how and so forth, expertise level, so all that. Is this a school teacher? Is this a hospital admin? Is this a high school student? Who knows, right? So you got to understand your audience. What are their goals, their motivations? What are they trying to accomplish with your product and service?
You also got to understand the context. Where are these things being used? This is particularly much more important as we get to smartphones and mobile devices, tablets, and so forth, right? But also think about the different context of a hospital or a school, a factory floor, acoustical situation, environments, right, where it's loud and noisy, right? Or they're maybe at a Starbucks or at an airport lounge, right? How many of you guys actually go out to these contexts and actually see them live in person? Right? I'm guessing probably not as many, right? It takes a little more effort, right? You got to get out there, right? You really got to put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're designing for and the context that they're in. Right? And you got to think about the guidelines for the different devices and platforms you're designing for. Right? Whether it's iOS, Android, HTML5, Windows 8, /Metro, whatever it is. They have some pretty good guidelines, style guides, and that kind of thing out there, which is great, and you should leverage those. They're created by some smart, talented people. They're trying to establish a baseline for their system, and you should use them. But always, at least the philosophy I espouse is use them with a grain of salt, right? There are probably things you want to do beyond what they're advocating for, maybe something innovative in terms of a gesture or a UI or whatnot. But it's a good baseline, right? So you got to think about your users, you got to think about the context of use, think about the guidelines, right? What kind of platforms you're designing for, and how can you leverage that? That'll get you to a pretty good starting point. But the point of all of this is the fact that at the end of the day, your mileage may vary, right? This is why it becomes extremely difficult for someone like myself or any other designer to simply say, okay, here are the absolute rules that you must follow, right? The button should always be purple, it should always be 20 pixels to the left, and all this kind of stuff. It's not going to work that way, right? You got to understand the variability of the context that you're designing for, right? For the people and the devices, the guidelines, the platforms, and so forth. That's why it's really hard to define, okay, what is that recipe, what is that formula? There is no formula, I'm sorry, there really isn't. But we have some patterns and principles that we can really follow and apply, right? Now, for those of you who are expert programmers, developers, you know about patterns, right? Software patterns, reusable patterns, and so forth, components, and all that kind of stuff. It also applies in UI design. And a lot of this, the lineage goes back to architecture and so forth. But patterns become very effective in terms of achieving consistency, so you can leverage pre-existing knowledge, right? And principles. Principles are very important. Principles, and this is something that a lot of people don't kind of get into. You want to jump to, okay, where do you put the buttons, where do you put the icons? Principles are actually your guiding framework. They help establish a baseline of how you want to design your interface in a way that supports your brand, right? Your company, your product, your service, and the kind of audience that you're really working with, right? That you're engaging with. So let me dive into that just a little bit. Patterns. So a pattern is nothing more than an optimal solution for a common problem. That's all it really is. There's nothing really kind of complicated about it. And we know these patterns, right? Over the past 10 years, 5 years, whatever it is, with web, smartphones, tablets, patterns have emerged around how do we deal with hierarchical information, with grids of data, with charts, master detail, right? You have simultaneous viewing of content and grabbing content from one place to another and so forth. So these are just some kind of draft kind of patterns. And we know these, right? We know them because we've used products like Flickr, like Path, like Facebook, like Twitter, right? Patterns that are distilled from the OS guidelines for Windows, Macintosh, and so forth. Right? This is actually a great reference and resource. Highly recommend it. UI Patterns. I think it's UIPatterns.com. Tons of screenshots, right? And it's a great place to start because then you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time, right? We all generally know how a login should be, right? How an error message should be, a registration should be, except for those guys who did the demo page. There are some basic things that we can just borrow and leverage from, right? And you just kind of study and see what works and what's not working. The thing about patterns is you don't want to apply it in a cookie-cutter fashion, right? Just kind of use it everywhere, right? You want to interact with them, you want to try them out, and you want to gauge, okay, is this working for my product and my needs, right? And this is where this kind of gets into the collaboration aspect. You got to work with the product manager, you got to work with the designer, figure out what makes the most sense. And you got to iterate and test with your users, right? Get some feedback and figure out which of these patterns are really working. Are your users most likely Most familiar with Facebook? Maybe there was some patterns in Facebook you can probably borrow those, right? A live feed of content or something. I don't know. So that's something to look into. Some pattern books to keep nearby. I use these as references. I know Bill Scott spoke earlier. Jennifer Tidwell, she's at Google. She's got a great book, Design Interfaces. And Erin Malone, she's a bit of a pattern master and legend in the field. She was responsible for the Y2Y pattern library, which I believe is still out there, so you should definitely take a look at that. By the way, I flagged slides where you should definitely take note of that. So patterns are good, right? It's a good place to kind of start. Principles. Principles are kind of higher level, right? These are kind of guiding frameworks, guiding statements that can really serve as a basis for your decision making. Right? Too often, we get caught up in the interface mechanics of, okay, well, we've got to have this button here, we've got to have this dialog box, we've got to have this icon, and all this kind of stuff. Well, all right, and then it gives you all these heated debates and arguments, and then it's like, all right, people get frustrated, all that. Well, let's come back to our principles, right? What does it mean for us, for our company, to create a good UI that supports our user base and our market and so forth, right? And there are different kinds of principles. Principles serve as a touchstone. They serve as a framework. They serve as kind of the last resort. So every time you're kind of caught up in a kind of bottleneck and a roadblock, you're not quite sure how to resolve this, let's come back to our principles. Is this decision going to support what we believe in? Right? At Citrix, we have a set of product design principles we advocate across the board for the entire company. And this includes the engineering team, the product management team, QA, customer support, across the board. So that everyone is empowered by virtue of these principles to raise an issue about a possible design problem, or some issue that they may find. Right? So we have 5 basic ones. Make it simple. Right? Simplify the UI. Don't expose unnecessary complications and complexity. Remember what we said earlier, complexity and craftsmanship. Right? Exhibit craftsmanship. Really beautifully articulated. Every pixel does count. And you got to work within those constraints. They're there for a purpose, right? So if the hex value of the color is such and such, follow that hex value, right? Focus on human goals, making sure that you're talking to your end users and really supporting their goals and motivations. Inspire a sense of delight. Create something that's beautiful. People like something that's delightful, that's beautiful and amazing and wonderful. It gives a little extra special spark at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, at least for us at Citrix, we strive to create unique value, something that is distinctive and innovative, and really sets us apart from our competition. So this is a set of 5 principles that we espouse at a corporate cultural level that we want everyone to support. So it's not about, where did the button go and where did the icon go, all that kind of stuff. It's about, okay, are we simplifying the UI enough? Are we really supporting the human and the user of their goals? And are we inspiring a sense of delight and so forth? That's at a very kind of 100,000-foot level. If we bring it down a little more, another set of principles. This is Dieter Rams, another legendary designer, industrial designer from Ron. Very much the inspiration for Johnny Ive at Apple. Dieter Rams is still alive, still there. And over the course of his career, if you look at all the products that he's done, the famous Braun kind of watches and clocks, and the stereo systems and so forth, he tried to exude a certain sense, very much a modernist style of design, very similar to Paul Rand. He tried to make something that was innovative. I'll just go through these here. Innovative, make a product useful, right? Be aesthetic, so have that sense of delight and charm and whimsy to it. Make a product understandable, right? Regardless of the complexity. Complexity is really a condition of not understanding, and not really understanding what you want out of it as the designer and developer, but also what the user wants out of it, right? So how do you encourage understandability? Make it unobtrusive. Right? Get out of the way of what the user is trying to do. Be honest to what it is you're trying to do. Have something that's long-lasting. Be very thorough in your design. Be very kind of detailed. This speaks to craftsmanship as well. Environmentally friendly, of course. And as little design as possible. You want to get gratuitous and be overly designed and try to show off and be flashy and all that kind of stuff. You really want to kind of minimize it. This is a nice set of 10 principles, right? Again, this emerged out of decades long, with a 50-year career of Dieter Rams and his work at Braun. A different set of principles, and now we're kind of coming down into like the nitty-gritty. Look at the Metro or formerly known as Metro design principles, you know, 5 basic things. So if you look at how Metro was constructed, and I think some of you have probably taken some Metro workshops, down a little bit into that. If you look at how it's constructed, it's not just, you know, big swatches of flat color and big squares, right? They're actually trying to exude a style that speaks to regularity, order, rhythm, control, and discipline, right? So that speaks to craftsmanship, being very exquisite and very precise so that how and where you place your content and functionality. Being very fast and fluid, right? Having very responsive and immediate kind of performance with the understanding this is all kind of touch-based and so forth. This gets back to performance of the engineering level, right? I always say that if you want to create a good UI, you got to have great system performance. And that's why I'm glad to see some back-end engineers and system engineers in the room. Because without that, your UI is all for nothing, right? You got to have great performance. Be authentically digital, that's kind of their language for being very precise and specific with the pixel medium. Do more with less, right? Don't just put lots of content out there, but really try to be very clever about what kind of content you need and how do you organize it, how do you collapse it without, you know, becoming too minimalist. Right? And when that's more of a corporate statement for them, having Metro becoming a standard across the board with all their devices and services. So that's kind of a way of talking about design principles, right? At a very language level. And then finally, this gets right to the heart of kind of UI mechanics of, you know, as Bill Scott, he's presented these principles before, you know, being very direct, being very lightweight, stay on the page, right? Try to do as many interactions as possible within that page so the user doesn't have to navigate out and get lost and confused and so forth, right? The technologies enable that, so let's support that. Keep the user in context. Provide invitations or cues that speaks to visual affordances. How do you engage a user and let them know, oh, okay, this is the place where you submit those credentials or whatever it is. Right? Use motion and transition cues that can help the user understand where they are and how to get back. Right? But also provide, I think, some delight and whimsy. And of course, be very immediate, instantaneous, responsive. So these are some principles, you know, from a corporate culture perspective to a language perspective to just the heart of UI mechanics that you can apply within your daily work. Now, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, what about that damn UI, right? I got a deadline, I got to, you know, fix this UI, I got to get it out the door, and all that kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, what is it you got to do? Where do you put the buttons? Where do you put the tabs and the icons and all that kind of stuff? So now I'm going to get into some details. Very much still at a high level, right? I mean, I can't specify exactly, right, the pixel dimensions and all that kind of stuff, right? That depends upon the specific project. But you can speak very generically and say, okay, don't clutter the screen with noise. Well, how do you know what's noise? Well, you got to understand the user's goals. What are they trying to do, right? What is noise versus signal for a user, right? Or your target user. Don't use every font and color in the palette, right? As tempting as it is, just kind of put any kind of font there that looks nice to you. Think about what kind of font you're using. And I'll dig deeper into that. Don't fill every inch of the screen with stuff, just to kind of fill it up. So because you feel like it's empty, white space is actually a good thing. You want the content to breathe and have focus and let it have emphasis for itself. Don't be verbose and redundant. You don't have to say, like with that registration screen, you're registering for the demo, you're registering for the demo. You don't have to say it 5 times. Let the content speak for itself and be self-explanatory. Right? Avoid having slow, irritating performance, as I mentioned. Speak to immediacy and responsiveness. Be instant. Right? We have become spoiled by virtue of the devices that we use with the phones and tablets and so forth. We want that fluidity. Right? Don't leave users hanging with no exit, obviously. Give them a way out. Give them an opportunity to cancel or save and cancel. And come back to it later. Ultimately, it comes back to just don't be painful and frustrating. Right? People want to have a really good, pleasant, satisfying experience. Doesn't mean everything has to be a wow factor. It just has to be, you know, calm and easy and smooth. Right? So what are some ways to achieve that? Well, do try to use a good metaphor. What I mean by metaphor is how you think about your product. Right? Is it a dashboard? Right? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it basically a report? I'm using some basic examples. Is it something else? Maybe it's a live feed, right? So this gets back a little bit to those patterns, right? The patterns kind of speak a little bit of the metaphor, right? We kind of intermingle this a little bit. But the idea is that you're using pre-existing knowledge that your user can tap into. And so they can understand what it is you're trying, that they can use at the time. Right? Use a very clean, well-defined grid. Grids are really important, and I'll show some examples of that. Use fonts sparingly. I typically start off with maybe 3 or 4 fonts, and then work up from there. Don't go to town with every kind of font variation. There are lots of variations, right? I'll show more about that. Color, you want to use color judiciously. You know, again, start really basic, really simple, and then work yourself up, right? And really try to solve the functional issues. How can we clarify it? How can we emphasize something? How can we punctuate that, yes, this is the submit button, this is where we need to go, right? Language is very important. Oftentimes, a lot of UI problems are just problems of language. You're calling it the wrong thing. It's not what the user would call it. So what is the proper language? This is why you've got to get back to you. You've got to kind of test out with them, get their feedback, what makes sense to them, right? And try to avoid marketing speak. Use icons purposely, right? And always ask, do you really need it? Right? What's the purpose of that? And then create some clear behaviors with feedback, right? Oftentimes, I mean, we've done this before, where you go to a website, click submit, and you're just sitting there wondering what's going on, right? You think that there was some kind of error, some kind of mistake. You know, you want to make sure you have proper feedback. And just the right amount. So let me dive a little bit deeper into some of these things. So with grids are important. You got to have a really well-structured, well-defined grid. You don't want to have content that's just scattered all over the place. If you remember the interfaces I showed you way at the beginning, those really nasty, kind of ugly-looking UIs, they just have way too much content, too much functionality, but it's just all over the place. There's no sense of rhyme or reason as to how to organize. Right? Every time we look at a UI, there is an initial impression. We do a scan. It's natural. We like to look at it, we kind of scan through it, try to make sense of it. And the better that things are organized in a way that we can simplify the sense making, it actually makes it a much more comprehensible UI and a more inviting UI that someone wants to interact with. Right? And again, all this stuff happens in a split second. Right? It gets back to the visual signal that we process. So having a good grid, it provides that structure, the order, the rationality. It's an interface design skill, quite frankly. It's something that takes years and years to evolve. But, you know, and just to show some examples, you know, this was actually an app that I had worked on several years ago for a video game startup company. You know, I bucketized a lot of the content and functionality in a way that makes it much more approachable, as opposed to being all over the place, right? Having really clear, demarcated lines of content and functionality. So you know which is the side panel that's kind of secondary extraneous information, and then where's the major kind of interactive space in the center. You have the header at the top, kind of, again, demarcates, separates that space out. Right? This is actually a really nice one. This is a real estate page. There's a lot of content there, but it's organized and bucketized in a certain structure. Right? And that structure kind of speaks to how you engage with the content. If you notice the table structure at the top, using kind of alternating kind of shading. Again, that's another way to draw your eye in without getting lost, right? And focusing as to where you need to be. Right? And you can have subgrids, grids for areas of content, let's say your side panel, which has kind of its own grid structure, and then a main grid for the primary content on the main page. So where do you start with this kind of stuff? There are various grid frameworks. Something called CSS nowadays. 960.js is a really good one. Blueprint, the Golden Grid, you can Google these. They're really nice because now they're becoming much more responsive. They're responsive grid structures that can allow the unfolding, the graceful unfolding content across devices. So grids, you don't have to start from square one. Just pick one, right? And just try to evolve the content using that grid. It gives you a code, basically a place to kind of hang your coat or hang your hat, right? Fonts and typography. So I know people love to go to town on fonts, right? I'm not going to go into too much detail about the typographic structure and the kind of anatomy of a font, but it's important to understand that when you apply a font, you're actually conveying a certain tone of voice. There's an issue of readability and legibility involved, right? I can jump to this one. So here I've actually said the same thing in 3 different fonts, 3 different ways, right? There's a certain tone of voice that comes out when you read each one, right? They have a certain feel to it, a certain distinctive personality. So you really want to be careful, and this is why, I'm sure I know a lot of engineers like to complain, oh, those designers are so persnickety about their fonts. The reason why is because we're trying to convey a certain personality, a certain distinctive tone that speaks to the company and the brand. Right? So it's important to be very judicious about the fonts. Also, to be very aware about the font variations. This gets back to the signal. This is unfairly a little bit of an older example of Google search from way back when. I think 3 or 4 years ago, they've significantly improved since then. But if you think about it, every font variation is a signal that's calling for attention. And what do I mean by font variation? I'm talking about typeface, whether you decide to make it bold or italic or plain, the color of the font, also the size of the font. So any of those kinds of treatments, every time you do one of those, you've introduced another variation. It's yet another signal that's calling out attention that I got to process and absorb and kind of figure out, right? And it adds to, at least when I look at this, it adds to a lot of noise, right? It adds to the complexity. I got to weed through all these, the noise of all the different font variations to figure out, okay, which of these search results is really the one that I need, right? And here's another really bad example. I think also Google News. Again, I think it's improved significantly since then. But if you look at and count at each one, you want to start, again, with a baseline of like 3 to 4, maybe 5 font variations, but you don't want to go out of control. If you look at either one of these, actually this one, every single one of these is a font variation. In this block, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then we've got 5 with the cache and with pages. If you look at the top, there are all kinds of different font variations happening. Every single one of those is a different signal that's calling for attention. So that adds to the complexity, it adds to the noise. The best way to take care of that is to really calm it back down. Reduce the number of font variations. I'm a big fan of Quora. I don't think it's perfect, but they do a lot of interesting things. It's a very text-heavy, text-based UI, but they clean things up. They lighten it back, right? Or lighten it up. They use tremendous white space to allow content to breathe, right? They don't have as many font variations going on, competing for attention and kind of shouting out, right? And they have also clean user grid, nicely defined areas of content. I mean, compare this with this, right? It's a little bit of a difference, right? It may be a bit subtle for some folks, but that kind of difference can make a significant improvement, right? In terms of usability and in terms of user satisfaction and task completion, right? So fonts are really important. You want to make sure your content is legible and viewable. Sorry, this is another good example here, just kind of combining really good typography, but also really good grid structure as well, right? So you can still have a dense display, and by virtue of retina displays, it's going to get denser, but through typographic variation and through really controlled discipline using grids, you can really pull things together in a really nice way. And it doesn't feel overwhelming. It doesn't feel complicated. Color. I'm certainly no expert on color. Color is one of those things that's a lifelong pursuit. It takes years to develop that sensitivity. But it's important to use color as a way to punctuate, to emphasize, right? It adds that emotional kind of impact to your screen. Mint has a really good use of the color to really convey and communicate functionality around, dealing with your expenses and managing the budget, all that kind of stuff. Really nice, clean use, right? It doesn't get in your way. It kind of, again, gently accentuates the content you're trying to propagate, right? Trying to push out, right? It's not all shouty and in your face and so forth. Google Analytics, I think, does a nice job as well with more kind of faded back tones and so forth. You really basically just want to start with a few basic colors, right? You don't want to go to town. Now, the thing with color, of course, there's always that subjectivity of taste, right, and judgment about, okay, what's a really nice color palette? That's where you're going to have to probably do some research and probably just leverage the talents of your designers, if you're working with a designer, and I'll talk more about it in my next talk. Also just look at, around you. Look at references and resources, magazines, right? Look at fashion, look at cars, right? How they do color combinations in a way to expose functionality and add that emotional boost, right, without being too strong and overwhelming. Right? Something I like to tell people is
you want to start with a base color, typically associated with your brand. So Facebook has the Facebook blue, Twitter has their Twitter blue, and so forth. Some complementary colors associated with that, so you can kind of pop out certain elements. Have a highlight that can be useful for a hover, and then black and white. Don't forget, black and white are colors too, right? And that's part of your arsenal. And you can actually use that to differentiate a segment, different content. So color can be challenging, but it's important to use it, again, judiciously. You don't want to go to town with it, right? I'm actually showing a screenshot from a really good resource. It's called Cooler. If you can see that, Kuler. It's actually by Adobe. It's a really nice place where people have created all kinds of prefabricated color palettes. It's a great resource to start, right? Pick something and try it out. See how it works. And again, go back to your users, get feedback. Are the colors interfering with their ability to accomplish a task? Or is it actually serving to help and punctuate and emphasize? Icons. We love icons, right? As a designer, I get requests all the time from engineers, we need another icon. We need another icon. We need more icons. Why do you need all the time? I mean, really. It will be a really good experiment. The next time you're tempted to get an icon, what if you had no icon? How would that affect the functionality? How would it affect the user's interpretation of that functionality? And get them to actually use it, right? Quora has very few icons if any. I believe very couple of slight few. Google has very few slight icons as well. Might be an interesting experiment to try for yourself, right? What if it was all text? What if you had no icons? And then you start to roll in the icons because you're trying to introduce some kind of status, some kind of functionality that really is primary and needs to draw emphasis to itself. Or branding. Branding is elements to be used as well. The idea is you don't want to clutter up the UI, right? You want to be very judicious, very careful. Otherwise it becomes a riot, right? And you're trying to make your way through this jungle of icons. Adds complexity. Every icon is something to be decided. That's the other thing about icons. If you have, I know some of you probably work on enterprise software, which can be very complicated, because you've got tons of functionality you're trying to expose. You've got to ask yourself, okay, what kind of icon do you need? Is it something that's branding element? Is it something for functionality? Can it be expressed in a different way? Maybe it's a tab, maybe it's a button, maybe it's a link, right? And then, of course, is it conveying status, right? Like traffic, that kind of stuff, right? So there are different levels of icons. So do yourself a favor and think more about why do we need these icons and what purpose is it really serving? And what happens if we had no icon? Would that adversely impact the UI? Maybe, maybe not. WordPress, I use the WordPress blog, and I find their admin UI really nice. I think they have a judicious use of icons, just enough to kind of break up the space, if we want to break up the monotony, kind of draw attention to a sidebar functionality. In other areas like the dashboard, just kind of calling that out, again, emphasizing the fact that this is the screen I'm on, so I know where I'm at, but I can also jump out to other places as well. And then you have your toolbar icons and so forth. The thing about icons you got to understand is, every single one of those is a signal, but it's also a symbol, right? It's a symbol that has semantic value. And it's trying to speak to the user. Again, it gets back to the notion of communication. The interface is a communicator, right? So make sure you're using icons that are generally well understood. It gets back to the common parlance. What's that language, right? There are websites all over, icon depots and so forth. You can probably just grab some basic general icons. Just leverage that. Why reinvent things, right? And if you need an icon to explain something, or actually let me rephrase that. If you need additional text to explain an icon, well, maybe that's not the right icon, right? You really want to make sure it's something that can be grasped very quickly, right? Somebody can scan it, understand it, and move on to the next. Language. Again, getting back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of UI problems out there are really just matters of using the wrong word, or really bad error messages like this, right? We've all seen really bad messages that just are too verbose, too redundant. Actually, I was going to show the screenshot of a dialog box I got yesterday. So, we have to do this kind of annual compliance training at Citrix, at all your companies. After I completed the training, I actually got this dialog box that said, "Warning, you have completed your training." Okay, I don't know if I should be scared or I should be delighted. So, that whole issue of mixed signals, right? So make sure the language is copacetic, right? It's all kind of supporting each other. So in particular, I know how it is with distributed teams and distributed work, but make sure that whoever's working on these, particularly dialogue boxes, whoever's working on that stuff is talking to the developer, talking to the designer, and make sure that content is supported all across, and you're using consistent words, right? So, I'm a recent project I was on, we've got this thing called we've got an inventory, we've got an address book, we've got a dashboard, we've got, I think it was a ledger and something else. They all actually point to the same thing. But we're calling it so many different things across different products and services and UIs as a matter of legacy, right? So you want to make sure you avoid that, rationalize your language, and get back to your user and see if does this word make sense? Also be aware of market speak. I know it's, the marketing guy is trying to push some really cool, sexy, kind of buzzwordy thing. You got to be really careful with that. With the user even understand something like that, or does it make it more complicated than use it? So be careful with the language. Oftentimes, most UI problems are just language problems. And I believe this is last but not least, behavior. At the end of the day, it really comes back to behavior. The interface serves as a conduit for communication, but it's also a way to get someone to actually do something, right? So you want to make sure that, this is all accumulative, right? It all builds upon each other. The grid structure, your fonts, the icons, all the interface elements build upon each other to scaffold towards getting someone to understand what can I do with this UI and how do I do it. Right? You want to make sure there's proper feedback as well. So this is actually just a couple small screenshots here. Lightroom, these are actually Lightroom and Aperture. These are two photo processing applications. Lightroom makes use of very nicely crafted, gets back to precision and craftsmanship, control points, really good sense of the mouse cursor changes. So think about that, right? What happens to the mouse cursor? Does it change as you hover over a control so it becomes a hand, becomes a pointer, becomes something else? So it communicates back to the user what you can do with this, right? And what kind of feedback about what I can, what I can't do, all that kind of stuff, right? And you want to make sure it's directly manipulable, right? So someone can actually try to interact with it, and they get, and this gets back to system performance, I can actually drag it, I get immediate real-time response and feedback about what I can do, what I can't do, right? And this, oh, sorry, I should go to this one. Bill Scott, again, he has this really cool diagram. It's a bit of an eye chart for you guys, but it's a way to map out what he calls interesting moments in the UI. So these are all those moments in which, you're inviting a user to interact with it. It's those hover states. It's those affordances that communicate and suggest, okay, this is what I can click on, this is what I cannot click on, right? What happens on a mouse down, on a double click, maybe a triple click, or a double tap, triple tap, etc., right? Map all that stuff out so you have a clear understanding across the board between the designer, the developer, the product manager, and so forth about, okay, how do we encourage someone to understand what this interface does and how we interact with it, right? And also prototyping. You got to prototype this stuff. I'm sure a lot of you do that anyway in the code, but I encourage you to just be very diligent, be very iterative when it comes to prototyping your content and functionality. It helps you make sense of what's working and what's not working, especially when you get back to users and get their feedback, right? And then, actually, sorry, coherence. Coherence is, as we start thinking about a multi-screen world, right? This is one of those new things we got to deal with. You got phones, you got tablets, you got web, you got your HDTV, and Apple TV, and all this kind of stuff. Well, what happens when you've got content and functionality that's shifting around, that's moving across these devices? Well, you got to be coherent. And that's a very deliberate word. So at Citrix, we decided to use the word coherent, not just consistent. And there's a difference. If you're consistent, that's a good thing. You want to be consistent. Data-ROM advocates consistency as a hallmark of good design. But you don't want to be cookie cutter, right? You don't want to just stamp the same UI on the phone, on the tablet, on the web, and HTTP, and so forth, because you got to be responsive to the environment and the context, right? Think about portrait versus landscape orientations, right? You got to think about, one-handed use versus a tablet use versus, you got a mouse and keyboard. Different kind of interactions, different kind of UI. So, some of the exemplars that we look to, Netflix, I think, does a really good job of having a coherent interface across the board. Does the same functionality. It looks a little different for each platform. That's okay, right? They're trying to obey the guidelines
guidelines for each platform, but also embody the brand attributes. Evernote does an excellent job as well, and so does Amazon with their Kindle services. So as you start to think about, yes, mobile first, but also how do we branch out to these other kind of devices and services and so forth, how do we make things coherent in a way that you're still applying the same UI, and so people don't have to relearn for every single device, right? They can still understand the core concepts, like movie selection or uploading your latest sketchbook or notebook or whatnot. So at the end of the day, what it means for everyone in terms of creating a good UI and those fundamentals, it's really a balance, right? I can't give you a precise recipe or rule book or prescription. It comes back to a choreographed balance of these fundamentals. Having a really nice grid structure, having really nice typography and fonts that can be legible across the board, color as a way to punctuate, icons used judiciously, not just all over the place, having a good metaphor for what this is. Is it a dashboard? Is it a spreadsheet? What is this thing? Making use of patterns so we can leverage and reuse knowledge from other places. Right? We've developed a nice compendium of knowledge for the past 10 years. Right? Let's use it. Right? And having really good behavior that's on target that helps people understand what it is they can do and what they can't do. So make use of those affordances, the feedback loop, to let the user know what's happening. And good principles, right? Whether they're corporate principles at a high level or just very specific language and guidelines principles like Metro and Mac OS and so forth. At the end of the day, you want to pull all this stuff together in a choreographed balance. That's really hard. I mean, there is no easy rule book for that. And this is where you have to do just iterate, iterate, iterate. Use some good stakes in the ground. There's some good baselines out there. I bet you some good reference books and so forth. And you got to start somewhere, but you always end with the user. Always come back to the user's feedback. What is their perception, their understanding? Are they satisfied? Are they completing their tasks? And so forth. And I just want to conclude actually with this quote. I just read actually a couple days ago by a professor at Indiana, their HCI program. The key to good design is not applying Metro or Mac or iOS or whatever principle. The key to good design is exercising really good design judgment. And design judgment is something that evolves. It takes time to develop that sensitivity. I truly believe that UI engineers, and even back-end engineers, I think you can develop that sensitivity, right? It just takes lots of practice. You got to start somewhere, right? Which is a bit of a segue for my next talk, which will be happening at 5 o'clock. So this is where I will be talking more about collaborating with designers, understanding that relationship, how do you hire a designer, and how do you kind of promote really good design throughout the team. And the last thing is just a final set of references, really good books that I always keep on my bedside, if you will. Highly recommend these. Feel free to take photos of this. Designing visual interfaces, designing web interfaces, envisioning information, and finally designing web interfaces. Lots of good books. A lot of them are really kind of complementary, and you're going to see the same thing iterated over and over again, and that's a good thing, right? At the end of the day, you have a core set of principles that you can apply for good design. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.